Anomalies. Anomalies.
Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
All right, welcome to another episode of Anomalies. We're a program that kind of deals with subjects that are kind of on the fringe of a lot of things we talk about in society. And one of the things I like about doing this program is you get to meet people from all over the world. And tonight we have a guest from a place that I've always been kind of curious about. We've not had guests from New Zealand before, but we have Suzy Hansen, who's a UFO investigator, and she's going to share some of her knowledge about what's going on with the phenomena in New Zealand, some of the aspects of the phenomena in New Zealand that are specific to that country. And by the way, Dave Jinks is running a little late, so he may join us later. Well, Suzy, thanks for being on with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Daniel.
Sure. So we were talking a little bit before we started recording here. Just give our listeners a little bit of background about you. You are not only have been a UFO researcher, but you mentioned that you were a teacher in a previous life, and you've had some interesting UFO experiences. So kind of give us your pathway to your present interest in ufology.
Okay, yes, I grew up in a small rural town in New Zealand, and I eventually went to Teachers College, trained and qualified as a teacher, and later on qualified as a grief counsellor. I guess I had some quite profound sightings when I was both a child and age 20, and those two events catapulted me into UFO research in New Zealand. At present, I have my own organisation in New Zealand called UFOCUSnz, which I founded in 2007. And we generally have around 6 or 7 staff members. It has changed a little over the years as people join and leave. And we're spread around the country, and we investigate sightings as they come in. I'm also have an author. I've written a book about my own contact experiences called The Dual Soul Connection, The Alien Agenda for Human Advancement. And I guess I kept those experiences quite hidden until a few years back, and then I decided it was time to put them into a book. I'd thought about it for a long time. And finally did it and published it and began speaking about it in 2015.
I was just going to say, how do people find your book? On your website?
It's on Amazon, yes, and it's
okay.
On Amazon. So I'm also belong to an international group called ICER, which stands for the International Coalition of Extraterrestrial Research. So I'm an executive founding member of that, and also the Australasian Continental officer for that group and New Zealand representative. And we are involved at present in reintroducing the topic of UFO research to the United Nations. That is underway now, with San Marino government taking up the banner for that and being responsible for bringing that to the United Nations. So there's quite a lot going on. I do a lot of work in the background and in the foreground, I guess. I've spoken in about 8 countries now about my book and my experiences, but also about my 48 years research into New Zealand UFO sightings. So I guess that's about a roundup of me. I'm a mother and grandmother and do ordinary things as well.
Well, certainly ufology is not very ordinary, but we're appreciative of your background. I think Dave has joined us. Maybe, Dave, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you
Oh, there
hear me?
Okay, so this is Suzy Hansen, Dave
Oh,
Jinks.
I'm gonna start video.
Hi,
There
Dave.
you are.
Hi, Susie. So sorry for the lateness and the interruption here. Had
That's quite all
some
right.
computer issues at work,
Okay.
and I didn't
Dave's
want to jump in at the wrong time. But great to have
Dave's,
you here.
Thank you.
Dave still works for a living, which is he's trying to change that. But anyway. So Susie and I were talking a little bit about our background. If you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience, and now Dave, the two UFO events you had. You had one at age 8, I believe, and then there was another one that you had, kind of a very dramatic one, as I recall. I listened to an interview you did with Dave Scott, and you talked about a couple of those UFO encounters. So share that with us if you could. Are you, can you hear us, Susie?
Oh, you're talking to me? I thought you were talking to Dave.
Oh, no. Okay. Well,
Sorry.
Dave may have had some UFO and
All right. Okay. So, yeah, there are really two triggering events in my life. There's been quite a few, but there's two that really stand out. One happened when I was 8 years old, and my family and I had quite an extraordinary UFO sighting just south of our largest city of Auckland. As I said, I was only 8. My father went out to shut the garage, came running in, told us to get out onto the concrete terrace, and he pointed out over a set of hills called the Bombay Hills that are south of Auckland, probably about 26 kilometres from where we were, where our house is. And there was a long glowing bar of orange light, extremely bright. And it looked quite well defined, but when my father got out a very old ship's telescope of his, an ancient model, and we had a look, we could actually see that it was slightly flaring and pulsing. This hung over the hills for about an hour and a half, and all our neighbours and people came out onto the street and onto their terraces and watched it. We were calling out to each other over the fence and talking about it. And at about an hour and a half later, having hung there all that time, it moved off. It moved off south down the North Island of New Zealand and was sighted by hundreds of people down the central North Island, and was reported in our national newspaper, the New Zealand Herald. So when I went to bed late that night after all the talk and excitement, I can remember lying there and thinking about what was flying it, because my parents were saying it must be a flying saucer. It's one of these flying saucers, you know, and I was thinking, well, who's flying it, or what is flying it? You know, who owns it and where are they from? Because they were saying things like it must be from outer space, because we didn't have helicopters that could do that. We didn't have anything in aviation, especially in New Zealand, that could create a spectacle like that. So that really opened up something in my mind, and I found that during my 8th year of life, I became extremely hungry for knowledge about space, the planets, everything I could lay my hands on, even about the history of our own planet and mythology and all kinds of subjects. I just became a very hungry learner. And I guess in my child's mind, something shifted in terms of how I saw us as people and how I saw something from somewhere else. So it opened up this window in my mind that said the possibility is there that there's people from elsewhere. What I didn't put together at that young age was that the dreamlike memories, strange dreamlike memories I'd been having since I was very young, actually related to contact. And I didn't really make that connection until much later. The second profound incident happened when I was a young teacher and I was 20 years old. I was traveling on a lonely country road and with a flatmate, and we saw a light appear over some hills several kilometers distant, and they suddenly flicked out, and we thought that it was an agricultural aircraft coming in to land on a farm, and that it had probably changed direction and therefore we couldn't see the lights anymore. But then they flicked on again and they hadn't moved from that position. They flicked off, they came on adjacent to us over the hills, not too far away, flicked off and moved back to the original position. This happened several times, and we're talking about it moving in a split second. 1 minute it's there, the next minute it's beside you over the hills, etc. So immediately my mind was eliminating any kind of aircraft or helicopter. It couldn't possibly have been that. My flatmate was a scientist. He had graduated in science, had a job in the area that we were living in, and he could not comprehend this. He got very angry because I kept saying, it's a UFO, and he kept saying, don't be so damn ridiculous, only much worse language than that, and said, no, it's a helicopter. And when I pointed out my reasons why it couldn't be a helicopter, he got very angry and very assertive that it was definitely a fast-moving helicopter, because he could not assimilate it at that time. After a few seconds, the light disappeared, and eventually we had sort of come to a standstill at the bottom of a hill, and we were about to embark on a roughly 2 kilometre straight across a long riverbed. And he suddenly said, oh my God, whatever it is, it's coming up behind us. And I stuck my head out the open window to look back and saw this massive glaring light wider than the road, sort of like an oval shape, coming up behind us and over the top of the car. Everything was shaking. It was absolutely terrifying. I could hear someone screaming, and later realized it was me. The light was so bright, it was painful to the eye. There was this graunching, grinding, metallic sound that went right through your body. And then I turned my head to look at my flatmate, which seemed to take me ages to do. And he was no longer driving the car. His hands were on his lap. He was in a sleep kind of trance state. And at that point, I must have lost consciousness. But just prior to losing consciousness, I felt the car leave the road. It lifted off like that feeling you get in your stomach as an aircraft leaves the tarmac sometimes. And wow. I didn't remember any more. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, late afternoon. We were traveling through countryside, and my next memory was a feeling of flotation, wind blowing my hair around my face because I had the window open. It was cold, and then we hit the ground and the lights of the car came on. We had landed on the ground or been dropped or put down, and we were at the far end of the 2 kilometre straight. It was now pitch black, and we'd lost roughly an hour and a half, getting towards an hour and 3/4 of time. It was night time, and we arrived home in a panic. Our mouths were dry, our hands were sweating. We felt sick. The next few days we had blinding headaches. I couldn't get him to talk to me about the incident. He became very angry and eventually left the flat rather than face me and my questions. But that woke me up to the fact that, what on earth is this? I'd had sightings in my life. I'd had these experiences and memories as a child. And at that point, I really began to tie it all together and to realize that something was happening to me and had been happening for a long time. And it catapulted me into research in New Zealand at that young age of 20, seeking out and interviewing people I'd heard had UFO sightings around farms or whatever, and people who'd in later years who claimed to have had some kind of contact.
Wow, pretty dramatic. So obviously you had some missing time things going on when you were in the vehicle with your flatmate. Did you ever undergo any kind of hypnotic regression to try to find out what really did happen?
I have been very fortunate in that some years later, when I was in my early 30s, I had another catalyst incident where I kind of woke up and I was standing in the hallway of my home with my son, one of my sons, and there were 3 greys there. By now, I had an understanding of what greys were. We'd had some information come out of the States to New Zealand. and they were standing there and they were conversing telepathically to each other. We had obviously been put into an altered state, and I'd slipped out of it. And not only did I not scream and start running, and I conversed with them. And this conversation is actually recorded in my book. And this was a catalyst because they said to each other, and I heard them telepathically say, she is aware and she is, she's cognizant, she can understand us. And one of them turned to me and said, it is time for you to remember more now. And from that time, I began to remember more increasingly of my experiences until it got to the point where I could remember an entire experience, the technology I used, what their skin felt like, what the purpose of the visit was, how I got there and how I got back, a great deal of information. But there were still some experiences where I could only remember bits and pieces of it. And those are the ones that many years later I decided to investigate under regression. But it took me, I had a number of researchers encouraging me in Australia and New Zealand to undergo regression. But at that time, in the 90s, there were 80s and 90s, it was a very new thing. People were quite suspicious of it. And so I decided just to keep documenting my conscious memories. But it was many, many years later. It took me about 20 years before I decided to have some regression to fill in the gaps. But I have a lot of conscious memory. And for whatever reason, they have allowed me to have that.
Interesting. Dave, I'm going to let you jump in here. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Well, I'm just taking notes here. So many questions I have for Suzy. You go by Suzy, right? Just want to make sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Suzy's fine. Well, first I'd like to say the New Zealand accent is my favorite of any accent on the planet.
Thank you.
Oh, it's so distinctive, and I love it. I love hearing it. In New Zealand, I'm fascinated with your country because my best friend, when he was 8 or 9 or something, I just met him. His family went on a sabbatical. It's like I think it was 6 months. A real significant vacation. And the way he described the land and the people and everything, it set this image in my mind of New Zealand as a sort of a fantasy world. And part of that is because, as you mentioned, it's very, it's remote. It's very, the population is very small relative to other land masses that have much larger numbers of people, of course. And that makes me think that New Zealand might be a very unique place to study this phenomenon. Because for one thing, you're very, very low or high latitude, whatever way you look at it, you're very low in the earth. You're in a very different area. I don't think Australia is obviously in the same area, but you can't really go much further, right, until you hit Antarctica.
Not much between us and Antarctica.
Yeah, and so I would guess, that possibly you have some very different UFO encounters and activities. Maybe that would be my guess, but that's my first question. Is that a good guess? Do you see a significant difference in the types of activities, or do you see really kind of the same thing that you hear other places?
I think in general, we follow the trend of other places. This is a global program that's going on here. It's happening worldwide. But for whatever reason, New Zealand has a massive amount of historic UFO sightings. They're still happening now, but a lot of people are just slapping their images or their stories onto YouTube or Facebook or whatever into social media, and they're not being investigated properly. Some of them may have some quite logical explanations, but we'll never know once they go on to social media. It's a scramble, isn't it? But certainly New Zealand has this massive history. UFOCUSnz alone has incorporated our own files and archive with those of a couple of New Zealand veteran researchers, the Dickerson archive, and we've got part of the Murray Bott archive. So we have over 10,000 sightings for this tiny little place with a small population. And that's only a snippet of what is probably out there, because whenever I speak publicly in New Zealand at any kind of small group, I always have people coming up to me saying, I saw this years ago, or my uncle saw that. And I say, have you ever reported it? No, we haven't bothered to do that. So there's oodles of wonderful sightings out there. And we seem to have a little bit of everything, you know, the usual range of shapes that you see overseas. But I think during the time of the 1977 to 80 worldwide UFO flap, New Zealand, of course, was part of that and had its own UFO flap, in which we had two significant sighting areas. And one was the East Coast Gisborne area of the North Island, where I was living at the time. That's where I had a lot of my own experiences as a young woman, but also the Kaikoura, Cook Strait, Marlborough area of New Zealand, where we had the famous Kaikoura light sightings happen. So yes, we do have this phenomenal history. We had the 1908-09 airships as well, a number of landing sites, all the usual things that many other countries report. We also have, of course, a very close relationship to Antarctica, and we have had our own station and base there for many, many years. As to whether that has anything to do with it, or whether we are just a nice remote place that's very hilly and lots of space where activity can take on what can happen with extraterrestrials or whoever, because I'm not saying it's all extraterrestrial, and very few people will hear about it or know about it.
Yeah, that's kind of the avenue that I was looking down here, is that maybe it would be an ideal playground, so to speak, for again, whomever is responsible for some of these. I know I agree, it's a mix. I'm sure Dan would agree too. It's very complicated, you know, this phenomenon. Which is why we haven't figured it out yet after 70, 80, 100, 200 years, whatever it's been.
That's right.
And so, let's see, you've had your own experiences, which puts you in a different category. I mean, compared to just the reporter who's objectively looking at this phenomenon, and most of our guests, I'm sure, Dan, you'd agree that they're more in the experiencer category, reporter, experiencer, investigator, as opposed to just, reporting on these types of things, this phenomenon. And I'm wondering, this is the question I always ask a guest who is fortunate, I use that word cautiously, to have one foot in both fields, the investigative field and the experiencer field. How far back do these experiences go in your family? Do you have a well-documented trail of these kind of experiences?
Yes, I do. My grandmother, who'd be, way over 100 now, my grandmother was a very psychic person, but so were her seven sisters. So I recall sitting around my grandmother's table on occasions as a child and hearing some of my great aunts talk about spirit things. They were involved in the early spiritualist church in New Zealand and Auckland, in the early explorations into energy healing, that kind of thing. Even seances and table rapping kind of activities, that was all part of their life. And so I was quite fortunate that growing up, that was considered quite normal to talk about that sort of thing. So the only time I really had to keep it under wraps was when I was at school or amongst other people. But within my mother's family, it was perfectly acceptable to talk about these things. and to examine them and question them and look at logical answers and illogical answers and that kind of thing. So it was very interesting as a child. So therefore, right from very young child, listening to this, it was normal to me. So there was never any desire to embellish or use it in any way. To me, it was perfectly normal until I went to school. I thought that, most people in families would experience this, and soon found out that wasn't the case. I feel fortunate in my research that I do have a foot in both camps, and I think that my experience as a teacher, which is really both a creative and an analytical profession, where you're used to keeping records and you're used to keeping looking at facts and recording detail. I think that's been really helpful to me as an investigator, because I don't get carried away falling one side or the other into sighting or contact or believing things that I think might be there but maybe aren't. I've always been very careful about that, and right from the beginning when I founded UFOCUSnz, I have a love of flying and I've flown gliders, so I wanted to look at the aviation side of sightings in New Zealand. So my first job was to find aviators in New Zealand who would be willing to join us. And I was fortunate to be able to get several to join who were pilots and air traffic controllers. So right from the beginning, we were very much on the scientific details, but my experience as an experiencer eventually became very valuable, because we would go and interview people and look at perhaps a site where a sighting had taken place, and I would recognize things about that person that told me there was probably more to this than they were letting on. So I would open the door and say, look, sometimes you remember things further down the track, or there's an aspect to a sighting, a sighting experience you might want to talk about further. So please let me know if there is. I'm very open to listening to that. And often you'd get that person come back to you and say, actually, I didn't want to say in front of the other people who were there, but seeing as you've said, you would listen to other details, I had this strange thing happen where I saw an entity, or I felt like the craft I saw was communicating with me, and this is what it said, or I saw something outside of the landed craft, etc. And a perfect example of that is a fantastic sighting that happened near where I live in 2012, where some hunters were out in the bush and they saw this light in the sky approaching. They thought it was another hunter with a spotlight, so they made their way down the hill into the valley, heading back towards where their car was in this fairly remote area. And then they saw this light come down and begin moving around in the trees, basically following them along their route that they were taking to get out of the bush. And eventually they came to a point which was above a paddock, and they saw this light out on the paddock. And within a split second, it was beside them. It had dropped its light, and it was a cone-shaped craft. And the story goes from there. It's a very complex and fantastic story. It's on our UFOCUSnz website. But very quickly realized that one of those hunters had experienced something more than just the sighting that took place and the close proximity to the craft. And eventually the story came out that he had seen an entity come out of it, float down from it, and one of the other witnesses was there, could verify it. And I won't go into the whole detail, but the whole process of speaking to these guys and the fear that they had of exposing what they'd seen. They were tough hunters, bushmen. They didn't really want to go into what they were told, but the evidence eventually came out. One of them had hypnotherapy, more information came out. So it's just being able to recognize that. And I think a lot of straight nuts and bolts sightings investigators are not always aware of these things, the little signs and the little triggers, and just the look on a person's face when you mention something that tells you that there's something else they haven't said. So it has been quite useful over the years.
Okay, I've just got one follow-up to that, and then I'll let Dan back into the conversation here. Do you think it's the openness that you were raised with that makes you more susceptible, maybe that's not the right word, but to having these experiences? Or do you think it's that you were predisposed to be a part of them, and therefore your family talked openly? I mean, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Do you have an idea about, or a feeling about
Yes.
which one?
Well, my as I said, my grandmother was a psychic. My mother was a psychic artist. Then as me, I've been like a psychic or medium since birth. I don't do it as a profession. It's just a skill, something I have. And my son. So it's come down the familial line, this familial pattern. But in my book, I outline an agenda and a number of programs that that certain humans on the planet are involved in, probably thousands or millions of people involved in it, actually. And I outline how this was outlined to me on a craft at age 8, and again at age 9, and then throughout my adult years, I began to have recollection of being on craft or underground or undersea bases and being given lectures about this whole agenda, our part in it, what we have to do, etc., and what we might see unfolding in the future. So some prophecy, not prophecies, but messages and warnings that we're to look out for. And at this point in time, for the last few years, I have been seeing those things that they predicted would occurring in the world, and I can basically go tick, tick, tick on the things that they said. So where we are now, it appears that we are moving fast towards something, but in actual fact, we're moving slower than we think, because we're now starting to examine in a new context a lot of the things that have been happening for decades, but they've been given a new image, new name, a new gloss, and suddenly the world is taking notice because of who's presenting it and the way it's being presented. But these things have been going on a very long time. So rather than admit that these things have been going on a very long time, certain governments are reinventing it and reintroducing it as a package. And I think we have to be very aware of that.
Yes, I could go on and on here, Dan, so you better jump in quickly. I know you got some good questions, and I like the way Suzy's taking us, because that brings us to the present and, what we can do about this, how we can control the narrative rather than having, governments or political people who have other agendas control it.
Yeah, can I just step in there? I think you're right, Dave, because what I'm seeing is certain people who've emerged out of the woodwork and they suddenly have this massive profile. But when you actually talk to them, they're very cagey about what they know, if they actually know a lot. It's not coming out. But they are directing this way and they're directing things that way, and they're throwing things into the mix, and everyone's reacting all over the place. And I am noticing two groups being excluded a lot from this narrative and this investigation, and that is the research, the genuine sighting researchers who have archives and who've been in this a long time and have seen a lot and investigated a lot. They're sidelined. And the experiencers, people have had contact, sidelined. Nobody in these new groups want to know about contact. It's all about naval footage, pilots seeing this, pilots seeing that. And we've got this little, what appears to me, and this is only my personal opinion, a little agenda emerging at play here. Why are people who've had decades of work, like myself and many others, why are we being sidelined? And why are suddenly so many scientists emerging from the woodwork who've never talked to us, but are talking about all kinds of research that's been going on? Well, where did the material for that research come from? It hasn't come from the run-of-the-mill investigators and researchers in countries all around the world, like many of the researchers in the ICER group. Nobody's asked to see our archives or talk to us about anything. So there's a whole new reinvention happening here, and I'm quite disturbed about that.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's so many ways you could take this discussion. So one way I want to take it is this agenda that you're talking about, Suzy. So what kind of beings have you had contact with? What kind of beings are trying to formulate an agenda that humanity is supposed to follow? To talk a little bit more about that, I find that pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's not that humanity is supposed to follow the agenda. I leave that kind of agenda up to humans, actually. I think there's a few more of those kind of human agendas around. The agenda that I talk about is a plan, if I can put it that way, that was put together by several extraterrestrial groups. The front people are the greys, but there are other species behind them. There's a number of mixed species. There's the mantids and what I call the rootstock of the grey race. So there's quite a few other species involved in this. And I think that they saw what was happening to our planet, particularly with the warnings about nuclear activity on the planet going back in time, several decades. And I think they also knew, perhaps from their own experience as civilizations, or being able to perhaps see into the future and where we are headed as a civilization, they saw our downfall being the degradation of the environment as well as coming Earth changes that may be cyclic, maybe to do with the sun, maybe to do with some cycle of the planet, I don't know, influences from our solar system or beyond. But there are things taking place on the planet now that are not so good, and we're being told they're going to get worse. So if this was all foreseen decades ago, they put together an agenda whereby they would introduce souls onto the planet, such as myself and many others who were born, I was born in the 50s, and we would come in 3 groups, which I call 3 waves. And incidentally, I was talking about this long before Dolores Cannon wrote her book about it, after having heard one of my speeches. So this is something that has been going on for decades. It involves millions of souls coming in at this time on the planet, who are being educated on the craft. They're being educated here as humans, but they're also having a vast education on the craft about what is happening and how best to go about not just combating it, but if I can say flexing and moving with it. There is a focus on survival, there is a focus on improvement, but there's also the acceptance in this agenda, which is a positive one for humanity, that if we don't listen and we don't start cleaning up our act and we don't start raising, in particular, our spirituality towards our evolution as a civilization, then we will encounter very difficult times on the planet that some of it will be of our own making and some of it will not. But nevertheless, these are conditions that we will face. And for those who may survive all of this moving into the future, that spirituality and deep compassion, both for humanity and for the planet, and for what may lie beyond the planet, any life beyond the planet has to be paramount. And so there's this rapid attempt to escalate our evolution as compassionate and spiritual beings. And I think that sectors of humanity have risen to the occasion, but there are very large sectors that have not and probably will not.
I'm struck by the benevolence of this agenda. And one of the things that it causes me to think about is our origins, the origins of humanity. So are some of these otherworldly creatures, do they have a stake in our success because we're from them, we're their experiment, I guess I'm just wondering where this benevolent agenda is coming from. What would you say about that?
Well, there's a lot of speculation on that, Daniel. There's a lot of perspectives being bandied around about, why they would come and visit us and why aren't they helping us, when in fact, if we've made a mess, we are the ones who actually need to clean it up. And the Greys told me and the humans that I was with on one occasion on a craft that this whole agenda is about creating change from within, or engendering or encouraging in humans change from within. They're not coming in to change everything for us because they would look like an oppressor, and they don't want to be that because they're far too advanced for that kind of behavior. So it is assisting us to advance ourselves. So it's a change from within is their catch cry, I would say. So this positive agenda, and it's a benevolent agenda because for a number of reasons, they may well have seen this happen to other civilizations, and I don't want it to happen to us. But also, if we look back in history, there's a lot of information out there now about how they have likely been a part of our life and our civilization for a long time, in terms of sightings and contact and influence on our civilization at various points that might have just given us that little push in a certain direction at that time without being oppressive or taking over or telling us what to do. So it's all been about our development and our evolution as a sentient species. Do they want to take us over? I don't believe they want to take us over, because if they wanted to do that, they could have just done it a long time in the blink of an eye, because their technology is so powerful. But they may want to be a part of us and our civilization in the future, and us be a part of theirs. And we can't do that if we are still a warlike society that wants to shoot at them and ask questions later or carve them up in a laboratory somewhere. We have to evolve way, way past that before we can have that open contact. So when will disclosure and open contact happen? I don't know. It may not be in my lifetime. It may be in my son's lifetime or my grandson's lifetime. I don't know. It's how long it takes us to catch on to the idea that we are responsible for ourselves, that we are responsible. We have to fix things. We have to work on things, because they're not going to come in here and risk themselves in any big way until we change. I have seen some of the technology they have on craft, and I talk about that in some of my speeches. And I'm very fortunate to have found a number of experiencers who have corroborative information on that, and I've included some of their stuff in my speeches, where they're able to describe the exact same technology, how it's used, what it does, etc. And in my second book, which I'm struggling to get written because I'm so busy, I'll be talking more about that. So they have technology that can really jettison us into the future and into a new world. They can't introduce that too quickly because, and I think I'm possibly the only or one of the only experiencers saying this worldwide, some of their technology requires a very spiritual or high frequency to be able to use it. And this is like a safety mechanism. If you are not of that vibe, you can't use the technology or make it work. And a lot of the technology I've seen on craft, I believe, and it's only speculation on my part, they've never actually said it, but they've implied it, is like a bridging technology. So people have said to me, oh, what the technology you talk about isn't too far ahead of what we've got already. And I say, it's a bridging technology. It's leading us towards their technology. But their technology, of course, is consciousness operated. And that's the missing link that we have. We have not yet been able to endow or imbue consciousness into technology in the way that they can. It is utterly miraculous. Some of the technology I've seen and used and can talk about is miraculous to us. But they couldn't introduce us to that. We couldn't use it. We wouldn't understand it. So there's this leading of humanity, assisting of humanity to keep us moving forward, keeping us on track without too much interference. But it's like just a gentle nudge this way and a nudge that way, a little bit of assistance here and a little bit there, trying to keep us on track and moving. But they have said we are a very fickle race, species. We're very fickle and we're often very difficult to deal with.
And probably dangerous too.
Yes, definitely.
More likely to shoot first and ask questions later.
That's right.
Dave, do you have there's so many places I want to take this conversation, but that's just where I want to take it. So feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, that is definitely a direction that could go far and far and be a long time. And I love that. And I wanted to jump back to what Suzy said about a safety mechanism, which is a great way to think of. We ask, why can't they just share their technology? Why can't we just blah, blah, blah? Well, it's because you don't give a gun to a kid, and I'm just wondering if this is, if you find parallels between some of the very ancient wisdom schools that we've had on Earth, the tantric Buddhism with the cities, the powers, the superpowers that only the most accomplished mental masters were able to achieve, and that kind of, to me, is the same thing. You have a built-in safety mechanism. If you're not pure of mind or heart, or however you want to look at it, you can't acquire those levels. If you're thinking of yourself as a video game character or whatever, you have to level up till you get to the point where you have earned that power. However, having said that, we've also achieved, what was it, 80, 90 years ago, the ability to split the atom or to fuse the atom. And we created great destruction. And that was, I think there's a general consensus, that's when the alien interest in us became strong and very apparent. And that's when we started blowing stuff up all over the planet. So we are able to achieve some of those powers that are much more powerful than we've earned, you could argue. And there are several schools of thought in the UFO field. You have Stephen Greer, and then you have Linda Moulton Howe, and then you have Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, and there's a real spectrum of beliefs about the intentions of aliens and the intentions of humans. And it seems to me that most of the experiencers, like Suzy, their messages have been largely positive. And I'm wondering if that's a uniform thing. I mean, is that the experiences that you speak with, Suzy? Is the message very consistent? It seems to be in the literature that I've read, but there are some researchers that say, no, there are some who do have an agenda that's not what Dan kept saying. It's not beneficial to humanity. It's more selfish in terms of what the other entities desire. And so how wide is that spectrum of different entities? Are there some who look at us like ants in an anthill and disposable, or are there other ones who say, we're indisposable, we need to join the galactic community, and all those cliches? What do you think that spectrum looks like in your experience?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things I could answer in there. I might forget some of them along the way. So well, a lot of people say, look, there's X amount of ETs visiting us, or there's 52, or there's 223, or whatever. I don't think we have the ability to know how many are visiting us. All I can say is that the species that I have had contact with are benevolent, but even they have talked about, and I actually wrote this in my book somewhere, They have talked about that they are dealing with interlopers. So they're dealing with a species that is coming into the planet at this time, whose they said whose agenda is not as their own as theirs is. It's not as the Greys that I've had contact with. So so there's always a possibility that there's going to be species coming in who are drawn here for a particular reason, see what's going on, and may try to take advantage of that. I sort of lost my train of thought because there are several things I wanted to reply to there. I think that most experiencers that I talk to anyway have positive memories. Some of them, like me, have had experiences that were quite frightening, but that was only because I didn't understand what was going on at the time. And also, for a little period of time in my late 20s and early 30s, I was influenced by people I know here. Some were elderly researchers who had got hold of Bud Hopkins or David Jacobs' books and were saying this is really bad and something terrible is going to happen to you. And I started worrying because I knew that on occasions either one or both of my children were going with me. And, as a mother, you think, oh, well, what if I come back and they don't? These kinds of things cross your mind. I'm only human. But at some point I realized, hey, they're teaching me things. I'm seeing some miraculous stuff. I'm learning so much. They're explaining things to me. They're not harming me in any way or shape. Also, having experienced a number of different modes of telepathy on craft, which I also write quite detailed about, I know that they can put you into an altered state, which just helps speed up the transfer process, etc., and it also helps to protect you going on the craft, etc. And then you become this person who, once you're on a craft, you suddenly realize who you are and where you are and why you're there, and it's all quite at home and normal. But there are some people who snap out of that state of awareness at a wrong time, or suddenly become confronted with something in front of them and are extremely fearful. And when you're in that state, you are not going to pick up any kind of telepathy from them that might be calming you or telling you it's okay or informing you of anything. You're just going to be blind and deaf to that. And all you're going to see is their somewhat static facial expression, which can appear quite scary. When you're in that state, that is another explanation for why some people have some bad memories, and some people also talk about having some bad things happen to them. I can't imagine that would be the species that I have been working with all these years, but we don't know who else is out there and who else might be mimicking these things, who else might be utilizing it in another way, and that includes humans with advanced technology as well as ETs.
Well, it seems that the ETs do have a fine line to walk, and that, as you mentioned, they could be seen as oppressors or even gods. That could be even worse. I think it'd be easier to have an enemy, I suppose, that you knew was the enemy, as opposed to gods who were not really gods or didn't want to be your god. And so I think that's the history shows that, at least when you get into the history of potential contact stories in the past, that seems to be the logical conclusion, is that humans in their state of development, at least, would view the star people as gods coming down. Well, I can completely understand, and I'm sure you can as an educator, you don't want to be looked at as a god. You want to be looked at as a teacher. So how do you remain a teacher in the eyes of students who are starstruck, or warlike? And so walking that fine line, I could see why many species would just say, forget that. We'll go work in a different star system where the challenge isn't so great, that you're talking to, primates who just developed beyond, the primate only level, the survival state,
Yes.
And so my question, though, is that the wild card unfortunately, is that humans, clearly there's a level of humans who are well versed and understand this stuff far more than the masses. And that's entangled in the military industrial complex, of course. It's the 18 intelligence agencies that we have. And New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken, is very well entrenched in that intelligence apparatus, especially given that it's such a small nation, you know, in a remote area with very small population. I'd like you to talk about how New Zealand has managed to get entangled in that, you know, structure, but also the dangers that humans will have their own agendas, of course. And I want my last question, I'll let Dan finish us off later, but my last question is, I'm sure you're aware of the whole Werner von Braun, you're nodding your head, so you know where I'm going here, but he warned that we would go through a sequence of events which would culminate in a faked alien invasion. And I know that you're predicting something for 2023, possibly. Something, I thought you specifically were having dates as far as when something like this might. Okay, good. Well then, I won't hold you to that because I must be thinking of someone else. I wish I was certain that you had specific dates, but I want to hear what your predictions are nonetheless. But can you talk about what I just mentioned about New Zealand?
Okay. Well, New Zealand has, we wanted nuclear-free Pacific, we wanted nuclear-free humanity, and a tiny little country, and I think our population at that time when we were campaigning against that was probably only about 3 million. So we went nuclear-free and said to the States and other countries, you cannot bring your nuclear warships in here into our waters, and we were punished for that. We were put out in the cold for a long time. But we are the ones who were living in the Pacific with all the nuclear testing going on in further north of us, which of course is going to affect us and everyone in the Pacific that America was doing. So it took many years before we were sort of invited back into the fold. And I believe we were invited back in the fold because we were needed in terms of the Five Eyes Agreement and other alliances with the States, Australia, UK, etc., sometimes Canada. So there's a new agreement at the moment called AUKUS, which excludes New Zealand. We're actually quite happy about that. We've maintained our nuclear-free status, and I think, you know, we went anti-apartheid for such a tiny little country. I think we've been a very morally upstanding country in terms of trying to achieve ocean parks and reserves where you can't go, where nature's left to itself, areas of Antarctica, areas around Antarctica, and these have often been opposed. Our proposals have been opposed by some of the larger countries who have vested interests. So we really have been a standalone little country in many ways, and people are very staunchly avid about our nuclear-free status. So what was the second part of your question, Dave?
Well, the relatively large presence of New Zealand is impressive, and I think it is because you mentioned the very principled stand that your nation has taken in certain areas as a leadership position. But the second part of that was the whole Werner von Braun.
Yes, that's
prediction. Right. And also, do you have your own predictions based on the knowledge? And let's admit it is insider information for sure that you have, because most of us don't have that kind of contact. But what can you tell us as far as, you know, predictions maybe?
Well, for people who would like to listen to me talk about this more in depth, I've actually got a speech on YouTube, and it's on the UFO Research New South Wales website. UFO Research New South Wales, that's in Australia, U4NSW. Their website should have one of my speeches where I talk about messages from the ETs. There's quite a lot of them in my book. There's some I haven't revealed yet, but I don't make predictions. I make observations that are based on what the Greys have told me and large groups of people I've been with. And I'd just like to say that on some of these occasions, I've been in an auditorium, either undersea, underground, or on very large ships like cities. And there've been around 250 people in those auditoriums, humans, being lectured to by the Greys, but not only the Greys, there have been humans there as well in the chain of command and in these talking in these lectures. So I have been watching things unfold. There's a chapter in my book, it's called Chapter 19, A Meeting at an Undersea Base, Disclosure of a Different Kind. In this chapter in particular, I outline a lot of the warnings and messages that they were giving. And they have said that the time will come when the Greys and ETs will be reviled by humanity. And that experiencers and people who claim to have had contact with ETs will be in danger. I don't like to think about that, but to me, it's definitely a potential and a potential reality. We look at the way we're obviously being sidelined at the moment. One would think that some of these scientists who are talking about technology, etc., might be interested in talking to someone like me or Steve Boucher or other people who've seen quite extraordinary technology that they can describe. Surely something we say might be of help to them or whatever, but no one's ever approached me. Some scientists have approached me, but not in that capacity. So I think we are moving down a track where society is, this is them saying this, society is going to become more and more chaotic. They showed us on one occasion a massive screen in an auditorium. We were all seated in a tiered fashion up the wall, and we were shown hundreds and hundreds of pictures in what I describe as fast time, quick time. So you were seeing several images per second, so that the screen was just a blur, but somehow or other we had been taught in our many years going on craft to register the frequency and the imagery of each of those things was flashing on the screen. The entire auditorium was in tears and in shock at what we saw happening to the planet. I'm just seeing the beginnings of that now, but they did say the sooner we move towards being a more spiritual society, the less that this will impact on us. This would imply that the frequency of the planet is very much tied to us and us to it. If mass consciousness can affect matter and can affect incidents occurring. But we saw streets on fire, cities on fire, people protesting and raging and smashing things in the streets, and humanitarian groups not able to reach groups where there are natural disasters because of political constraints, regional constraints, all kinds of constraints. And we're seeing that happening now, where humanitarian groups can't get into countries because of political endeavors or whatever. So, and then they talked about the time when we would have multiple things happening. So we had a little glimpse of that with COVID, where there was the COVID restrictions, but then there were eruptions happening, and there were floods happening, and there were food production shortages and droughts, etc. So you have several things impacting on some countries. But they talked about the time when this would be almost global, where every country would have 2, 3 or multiple things happening. And I think of a country like New Zealand, where we've got 700 and something earthquakes happening every couple of days here at the moment. We have volcanoes, we have undersea volcanoes, and we have more and more cyclones, tropical cyclones coming down and affecting us, excuse me. So we can see this happening where there's going to be multiple things happening and we can't cope with it. So this whole thing about spirituality is going to be essential if we're going to override this. We're going to be able to cope with this. This is a very serious thing that's happening on the planet, is this chaos. And I see some of the political agendas and some of the social media agendas and lots of agendas everywhere at play that are totally confusing people and taking away people's peace of mind and ability to approach a problem logically and sequentially. So people are just, excuse me, I don't know what's going on here. Got phones ringing in all directions. People are at a loss as to where to turn. And one of the predictions they made, which I saw in 2015 when I was speaking in Europe and Scandinavia and UK, was that they said there would be millions of people, a time would come there'd be millions of people on the move, looking for somewhere to belong, looking for somewhere safe, looking for somewhere to feel that they can live and settle and escape what has been happening to them. But there will be so many earth changes happening, there will be so many food shortages happening, there'll be so many political agendas and wars happening that these people will be roaming and with nowhere to go. And I really saw the beginning of that going down through Europe and seeing the immigrants coming out of Africa, coming up through Italy, etc. So we've seen that happening worldwide with, columns of people aimlessly wandering and setting up camps and not belonging anywhere. Then we've got the more natural disasters that happen, the more food shortage we're going to have. The less ability we're going to have be able to grow food. So we have some mighty challenges ahead of us. And at the moment,
all this is without the possibility of this fake alien invasion. And when you brought up a point that I've never considered, and I appreciate it, and that was that those humans who are allies with or in contact, let's say contactees, experiencers, you, unfortunately, being one of them, could be lumped in as allies of the enemies. And I never looked at it from that perspective, but that could be a very powerful thing. It's reminiscent of concentration camps and the horrible things that humans have done to each other over the decades and centuries, is that guilt by association could make it really messy.
That's right. And I've been talking about this since 2015, bringing this out, because what I'm seeing is, to use my good friend Robert Salas's expression, a big door has been opened. Mm-hmm. And anyone who wants to claim alien contact has gone rushing through it. So we now have millions of people claiming contact for all kinds of things that we're uncertain as to how many of those are actually realistic, if I can put it that way. Mm-hmm. So, people will jump on a bandwagon. We know this is human nature. People get caught up in something that's really interesting to them. It becomes a part of their life. Then all of a sudden they're an experiencer. But the Greys said at the time when this happens and life becomes a little bit more difficult for people claiming, all those people will just disappear, gone. Because those who have been trained on the craft, those who are part of this positive agenda, have to have commitment. Mm-hmm. And you have a look around. There's lots of people claiming, love and light, contact and that, but where will that commitment be there if things get really rough? So this is a real reality. And I just want to say, in 2018, when I spoke at the UFO Congress, someone tried to take my life. I was sprayed in a lift with what turned out to be a concoction of very virulent lung bugs. So by the time I got back to New Zealand, I had a bacterial skin infection, a bacterial blood infection, and a bacterial lung infection. I was rushed to hospital and nearly died. And it was actually an American doctor who happened to be in New Zealand for just a couple of days lecturing, who just happened to have come down to my little city for one night to stay with the doctor. And they knew she was there, the staff knew she was there, and they called her in. She came into my local hospital. She said, take her off that antibiotic, put her on this strip, put her on that. I was away with the ferries, but I could hear her voice telling them what to do. They said she'll go down a long way first and then she'll bounce back, hopefully. And I did. But I was very ill for months on end. And there was another researcher at the Congress who died in Phoenix Hospital of the same thing. He was also sprayed in a lift at the hotel like me and lost his life. This has never been acknowledged by the powers that be associated with that Congress. I wrote to them and I received no reply. So I happened to be talking on the Saturday about alien technology I had observed, and I was asked by the organizers of the conference to talk about the technology because they had Lou Elizondo speaking on Zoom at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They kind of wanted to tie the whole technology thing together. And on the Sunday morning, I was sprayed in a lift. And by the time I got back to New Zealand on Tuesday, I was nearly dead. So, you know, this hasn't just happened to me. It has happened to other prominent experiencers as well. Think of Sherry Wild, you know, the researcher who died in Phoenix Hospital, myself and many others who I won't name, who faced this kind of thing. And what do we all share? We all share this very powerful commitment to talk about this, to talk about contact.
And that is very threatening to a certain group who desperately want to control the narrative. As you're saying, it's a very narrow slice of the entire phenomenon that we're seeing in the news, and we're looking at 10, 12-year-old videos that are really rather mundane compared to some of the, you know, reports that we have and have had for decades. And they want to control it. They want to put it out on all the media and control it and have the discussion revolve only around that particular tiny, almost irrelevant part of the entire, you know, the whole of the phenomenon. So what
absolutely agree with that, Dave. And I think your assessment of these little bits of footage, etc., from these blur footage, etc. And we look at, I could name some of the sightings that have happened in New Zealand that involved pilots and military pilots, and they're phenomenal, and they were witnessed by other members of aviation. It was, things were on radar, all sorts. But we don't hear about those. I talk about those publicly. They're on my website, but they are all, this is what I mean, the whole research field for 70 years has been sidelined for this new stuff, which is military and leading somewhere. Where is it leading, and should we be very worried about that? I say yes. What
do you say, Dan? I've been monopolizing again, but she's got so much interesting.
I don't view it that way, Dean. I just view it as you're contributing to the conversation.
I know, but I know you've got your unique perspective. You always bring something to the table. So,
well, what I'm worried about is Suzy's already in the future there in New Zealand, and we don't want her to be a decade ahead of us. So I want to be conscientious about time and thank her very much for sharing her information with us. Tell us again the name of your book, and you said it's available on Amazon.
Yep, it's called The Dual Soul Connection, The Alien Agenda for Human Advancement. It was written with Dr. Rudy Schild, from astrophysicist from Harvard University, contributed to it, examined all of my material and said, I understand this from a physics and cosmological perspective, and I'm happy to be part of your book. It's available on Amazon in English and now also in French.
Amazing. That sounds great. I will definitely check that out. Add it to my collection.
The other thing I was going to ask, but it would almost be taking the conversation backward, and I don't want to do that because I want to be cognizant of time here. What would be a good resource, Suzy, for Americans to understand the significant UFO events that have happened in New Zealand? I'm thinking in the United States, we've got Roswell, we've got, just a variety of cases like that. Is there in your book or any other resource? Is there a link?
Yes, my website they can look at. It's a new website that's replaced an older one, and we're still adding to it at the moment. So there are some sections that have not got anything on yet, but there's some good stuff on there still. And that is www.ufocusnz. So that's ufocusnz.org.nz. It's got a lot of articles I've written, as well as sightings. It's got military and aviation sightings, police sightings, astronomers sightings, and archival material, some of my speeches. So there's quite a lot on there that people can look at. We also have a number of New Zealand books that have been written, but it's interesting to note that just before the New Zealand UFO files were released, and I lobbied for 2 years for the release of the files, or some of the files anyway, not all of them. Just before that happened, many of the old New Zealand UFO books magically disappeared from our second-hand stores. So when people rushed to second-hand stores to get some UFO books to have a look at because of the interest shown in the files by the public, they weren't there. They were all gone.
How suspicious.
Mm.
How suspicious.
Yeah.
Well, once again, I just want to thank you. I'm sure Dave feels the same way.
Oh,
Just
yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for spending time with us. And this is,
You're welcome.
we could talk for hours, but we don't have hours here. You've got other things to do besides have a conversation with us. But if you'd come back sometime and have a part 2 of this discussion, I think
Very
that would
happy
be
to do that.
great.
Very
But
happy to
thank
do
you.
that. You can, if you read my book, maybe we can get into some more stuff there in depth. There's a lot of New Zealand stuff and experiential technology stuff there. So thank you
think
very
that's a
much,
plan.
both of you. It's lovely to meet you, and thank you for having me on your show today.
Yeah. Take care, Suzy.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.
Bye.